Buenos días. Vamos a ver lo que quedamos de ver en diciembre. En diciembre estábamos viendo algunos elementos del cine mudo. Entonces vimos a Méliès, vimos a Lumière y vimos la película del gabinete del doctor Caligari. Ahorita vamos a continuar viendo algunos elementos de cómo evoluciona el lenguaje dentro del cine mudo. Muchas veces se dice que este lenguaje de cine mudo o de cine primitivo era como un poquito no tan avanzado. Más sin embargo, esto se va a deber a que las primeras películas solamente requerían de un plano sin que se moviera la cámara, aparte de que estas películas duraban muy poco tiempo, 30, 45, un minuto. A medida que esas películas se van haciendo cada vez más largas y que necesito contar una historia más elaborada y con elementos más expresivos, es que va a surgir los diferentes planos, los diferentes movimientos de cámara y todo lo que tiene que ver con el montaje. Entonces vamos a ver cómo evoluciona este cine mudo a partir de las diferentes necesidades expresivas. Entonces vamos a comenzar viendo cómo evoluciona este cine mudo a partir de las necesidades que tienen que ver con el montaje.
Every artist should hold a desire to transgress his or her medium, and do so by advancing the methods of artistic creation that personify the form. This in turn can pave a path for future artists to enable even further advancement. The reinforcement of this philosophy is what makes art eternal. All art forms find their identity through characterizing techniques that make them self-contained systems which can't be replicated. And if there were one technique that distinguishes cinema, it's the craft of editing.
And editing is why people like movies, because in the end, wouldn't we like to edit our own lives?
Rather than the typical adage, which is that editing is the cutting up of film, many editors define it as the assembly of film. But beyond the basic function of putting a film together, the craftsmanship of editing can be dealt with such subtlety that it can be the foundation of a film's pace, its atmosphere. It can even be the enriching ingredient to strengthen all a film's themes, and you may not even notice. The best editing is often one that buries details of a movie into our subconscious, only for them to be realized later. Because the purpose behind a cut is not just to keep the plot moving, it's about control. The decision of what we get to look at lies on the editor, and they in turn hold total manipulation over our emotions.
You're a tough man, Rupert. You gotta be in this business.
Although literature too has the ability to divert perspectives, cinema is able to create tangible visual context through its absolute control of space and time. Editing turns the act of movie making into the art of cinema.
Editing is manipulation. We're manipulating reality as the audience sees it, because you want the audience to respond in a certain way, whether it's a laugh or a sigh or a fright. Everything's manipulated. And some people say, well, this director, he's manipulated the audience. Well, that's so naive, because that's all we do is manipulate.
At cinema's genesis, the notion of editing was incomprehensible. Cutting didn't exist because anything exceeding one shot wasn't necessary. Filmmakers of the era filmed nothing more than what interested them at the time, and the earliest cinema was a mere animated photograph of life. The Lumière cinematograph was deemed an invention without a future. However, through a combination of both intuition and good fortune, artists such as Georges Méliès and George Albert Smith discovered that film stock could be ran through a camera and stopped to be resumed at a different location. This camera trickery was able to progress stories through a variety of spaces, and the fundamental basis for all editing that followed was born: the cut. Filmmakers learned that through cutting, artists gained the ability to manipulate the fictional space a film took place in. Audiences quickly took to this almost abstract shift in perspective and were able to clearly infer the information that couldn't be seen. A realization then occurred in artists such as Edwin Porter, who found that if editing was able to control the space of an image, perhaps it could control time also. Prior to this discovery, the assumption was that audiences needed to be shown every piece of information. In this shot from the life of an American fireman, we see that the actions play out unnecessarily long. Even here, we see a fireman exiting through a window and then cut to him re-exiting the same window from outside. But editing soon became the tool of how to compress time in singular scenes. In their later films, these very same artists would cut to a new location in the middle of an act. The notion of cutting on action had already become naturally sewn into the fabric of film. And it was the arrival of D.W. Griffith that would allow the full capabilities of continuity editing to become established. Both time and space could be controlled simultaneously through the development of intercutting, a device that could have numerous plots being told parallel to one another. Establishing shots expanded the geography of scenes, reaction shots became integral pieces to a sequence, and even the emotion of a shot could be punctuated by cutting in to a closer angle. Through the development of continuity editing, the possibility for how stories could be told through more visual means had been furthered. It wasn't long before Soviet cinema took the ideas put forth by Griffith and his contemporaries to generate a new theoretical concept towards editing: montage. Opposing the emergent method of continuity editing that refined space and time, the Soviets eschewed the notion to develop a new language that communicated through the editing itself. The way in which scenes were now assembled was done so for the purpose of displaying a shot within the context of another. Intellectual montage was the theory that a shot only gains its context relative to what preceded it and what followed it. New subliminal meanings were created through the juxtaposition and comparison of a scene's imagery. Cinema could now demonstrate the rising of a lion matching the horror of the people, or the comparison of two symbols of power. Time and space took a back seat as underlying ideas became the key message of the edit. Whereas continuity editing popularized the invisible cut, ways that films could play out without the audience noticing the editing, intellectual montage made cutting salient. Editing became a lot like music. A misplaced phrase, an out-of-sequence shot, and the entire symphony falls apart. As we mentioned, every medium requires one technique that must be built upon to transgress the form further. Well, editing was cinema's technique. And within 30 years from the birth of film, every editing method that is used today had been established. So with this framework now set, what can editors do with it? Ultimately, there are three key tasks an editor must fulfill when arranging a scene. Which shot do you use, where do you begin it, and where do you end it?
In the end, there will be probably 5,000 shots in the film, and all of them have to ultimately be the right shot in the right place for the right length of time.
So how do these decisions build the bridge from film being a visual abstraction to a comprehensive language? First, editing should be approached knowing that any shot by itself can evoke ideas. These can be through either actions or tones. For instance, one shot may suggest a subject's intrigue. And another may represent a peculiar mindset. But finding the precise rhythm to know when these shots should end can enhance that emotion.
Bueno, estamos viendo la evolución del cine mudo. Esta evolución del cine mudo va a ser en todos sus aspectos, en la actuación, en la iluminación, en el encuadre, en los movimientos de cámara, en todo lo que representa, lo que tiene que ver con la parte de la forma cinematográfica. Vamos a continuar viendo esta evolución principalmente dentro del cine mudo y vamos a pasar a ver una serie de Martin Scoserse. Martin Scorsese dice que si yo quiero ser director de cine, tengo que conocer el cine antiguo, el cine mudo, el cine clásico, el cine de los 40s, de los 50s, el de la modernidad 60s y 70s, porque no puedo partir de cero. No solamente con agarrar mi cámara y salir a filmar, me va a ser un cineasta, tengo que conocer la historia del cine. Y uno de los momentos más importantes dentro de la historia del cine va a ser esa etapa del cine mudo. Martin Scorsese hizo esta serie de programas y en esta primera parte va a contar cómo evoluciona el cine mudo en todos sus diferentes aspectos, como un lenguaje, como una narración, como una gran maquinaria de contar historias. Qué mejor que Martin Scorsese, uno de los principales directores del cine estadounidense, para que nos cuente esta evolución del cine mudo en relación con las principales películas, desde los Lumière hasta pasando por otras películas muy importantes de este periodo.
To tell his story, to implement his vision, the director has to be a technician and even an illusionist. This means controlling and mastering the technical process. Our palette has expanded tremendously through a century of constant experimentations. The movies grew from silent to sound, black and white to Technicolor. Standard screen size to CinemaScope, 35 millimeter to 70 millimeter. The American industry, it seems, never failed to embrace new technological developments. Somehow, it moved faster and more decisively than its foreign rivals. As King Vidor said, the cinema is the greatest means of expression ever invented. But it is an illusion, more powerful than any other. And it should therefore be in the hands of the magicians and the wizards who can bring it to life. Here, Buster Keaton, an aspiring cameraman, is showing his footage to MGM executives in the hope of getting a job. Unfortunately, he has double exposed the film and the screening is a disaster. However, as every director will experience, accidents can be the source of extraordinary poetry and beauty. What Keaton's cameraman needs is to learn and master the language of film. Interestingly, most of the early film pioneers, including D.W. Griffith, had no formal education. They were self-taught and often shared the prevailing prejudice that the cinema was a minor form of entertainment. The American film probably came of age in February 1915, when D.W. Griffith opened his first feature-length epic, The Birth of a Nation. According to Raoul Walsh, who was one of Griffith's assistants at the time, and who played the role of John Wilkes Booth, it took The Birth of a Nation to convince Americans that films were an art in their own right, and not just the illegitimate offspring of the theater. How did Griffith achieve this triumph? Essentially through his composition and orchestration of the shots. As Walsh put it, the high and low angled shots turned a good picture into a great one. One close-up was worth 1,000 words. Erich von Stroheim, also one of Griffith's assistants, said that he was the pioneer of filmdom, the first to put beauty and poetry into a cheap and tawdry sort of amusement. I've always felt that visual literacy is just as important as verbal literacy, and what the film pioneers were exploring was the medium's specific techniques. In the process, they invented a new language based on images rather than words. A visual grammar, you might say. Close-ups. Irises. Dissolves. Masking part of the screen for emphasis. dolly shots. Tracking shots. Now, these are the basic tools that directors have at their disposal to create and heighten the illusion of reality. When Lillian Gish called D.W. Griffith the father of film, she used the same analogy. She said, he gave us the grammar of filmmaking. He understood the psychic strength of the lens. Half a century later, Stanley Kubrick may have had Griffith in mind when he remarked that what is truly original in the art of filmmaking, what distinguishes it from all the other arts, may be the editing process. Watch how Griffith developed, 2 years before the birth of a nation, the technique of cross-cutting. He shows you two events happening at the same time and intercuts them to increase the tension of the suspense. Now, at that time, Griffith had to fight his distributors who feared that audiences would be confused by this innovation. It was in the great epics of the silent era that the illusionists learned to use special effects and visual wizardry to conjure up some of their most compelling visions. The American tradition of the great spectacle was born around 1915, when D.W. Griffith saw Cabiria, an Italian superproduction. Watched it twice in one night. It inspired him, gave him the audacity to create his masterpiece, Intolerance. Giovanni Pastrone's Cabiria had all the right ingredients: adventure, melodrama, pageantry, religion, extraordinary production design, and striking camera angles and lighting. To film this scene, they actually dragged Hannibal's elephants up onto a mountaintop. Intolerance. Much has been made of its extravagant budget, real-size sets, and thousands of extras. The achievement is all the more extraordinary because Griffith worked without a script. It was all planned in his head, not on paper. But Griffith went even further. Intolerance was a daring attempt at interweaving stories and characters not from the same period, but from 4 different centuries. Freely cross-cutting from one era to another, he blended them all together in a grand symphony devoted to one idea: passionate plea for tolerance. Griffith's passion for history was balanced by his passion for simple people, the victims of history. In modern-day America, a young woman is deemed an unfit mother because her husband is in jail. Oppression is represented by society matrons, Puritan reformers who want to place her baby in an orphanage. Griffith's distressed heroines carried with them the heart and soul of the picture. For them, he composed his most eloquent close-ups. Like Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille liked to paint on a big canvas. His ambition was to tell an absorbing personal story against a background of great historical events. His first biblical epic was inspired by one simple belief: You cannot break the Ten Commandments. They will break you. Watch DeMille's masterful staging of the Exodus from Egypt. The visual contrast between the Pharaoh's war machine and the simple caravan of the Israelites. His sense of wonder. His attention to details, even in big crowd scenes. His miniatures were as powerful as his frescoes. DeMille even used an early two-strip Technicolor process here. However, the grandiose set pieces were always subordinate to the story. DeMille knew that spectacle alone would never make a great picture. He spent much more time working on dramatic construction than on planning photographic effects. The audience, he said, is interested in individuals whom they can love or hate. DeMille believed that he could translate the words of the Bible in the medium of film literally. To achieve this, he devised extraordinary technical effects, such as the parting of the Red Sea. DeMille insisted that every detail be seen with equal clarity. Here, for instance, notice the rocks and seaweed scattered on the sand to make the beach look like the bottom of the sea. It was a last-minute inspiration on the part of DeMille, who led his army of extras into the surf and showed them how to gather the kelp. Of course, I never saw DeMille's silent films when I was a boy. His later epics are the ones that made an indelible impression on me.
Before the dawn of history, ever since the first man discovered his soul, he has struggled against the forces that sought to enslave him. He saw the awful power of nature arrayed against him, the evil eye of the lightning, the terrifying voice of the thunder, the shrieking, wind-filled darkness, enslaving his mind with shackles of fear. Fear bred superstition.
And then there was DeMille's own remake of the Ten Commandments, which I have seen countless times.
There, where he struck the river, he bleeds. The water turns to blood.
DeMille presented such a sumptuous fantasy that if you saw his movies as a child, they stuck with you for life. The marvelous superseded the sacred. What I remember most vividly are the tableaux vivants. The colors. The dreamlike quality of the imagery. And of course, the special effects. God is a unique flame, but the flame is a different color to different people. These were the words of Ramakrishna, which DeMille quoted to define his own faith.
Great Lord of the lower world.
The great illusionists of the past, Cecil B. DeMille, D.W. Griffith, Frank Borzage, King Vidor, were conductors. They orchestrated visual symphonies, what Vidor called silent music. It would fade away as Hollywood embraced sound, but the legacy of the silent era was remarkable. American movies had matured into a sophisticated art form with elaborate camera moves, long takes, deep focus, expressive lighting, miniatures, etc. And in the late 20s, the most exciting experiments were taking place at the Fox studios, where the German master, Friedrich Murnau, was given carte blanche on the strength of his European triumphs. His film Sunrise became the most expensive art film made in Hollywood. Rather than a plot, Murnau offered visions, a landscape of the mind. His ambition was to paint his character's desires with lights and shadows. This is how the frenzied city girl tempts the young farmer, with a kaleidoscope of images. She wants him to leave everything behind, his land, his wife, his child, the peace and innocence of the country life. The vamp has planted a deadly thought in the young husband's mind. Murnau calls Sunrise a story of two humans. This song of the man and his wife is of no place. You might hear it anywhere, at any time. They don't have a name. But you experience every idea, every emotion that visits them. He had George O'Brien's shoes weighted with 20 pounds of lead to give the actor a more threatening presence. Murnau was called a cerebral director by his Hollywood peers because he demanded that his actors fully understand the mind of their character. He said, "I talk to an actor what he should be thinking rather than what he should be doing." Camera, said Murnau, is the director's sketching pencil. It should be as mobile as possible to catch every fleeting mood. It must whirl and peep and move from place to place as swiftly as thought itself. Later in their journey, the broken couple is reunited. Fear and guilt fade away. They become invulnerable. Nothing can harm them anymore, not even the city's hustle and bustle. Magically, subjective perceptions take on an objective reality. A superimposition could serve as an inner vision or an inner monologue. What Murnau is projecting onto the environment is their dream, their common dream. At least for a brief moment. In Sunrise, love and death are intertwined like day and night. But in Seventh Heaven, love negated death itself. Both films star Janet Gaynor, who commuted between the two sets, working with Murnau during the day and with Borzage at night. She is a street angel. She's saved by Charles Farrell, a street sweeper. Reluctantly, he takes her to his lofty garret above the city. He works in the sewers of Paris, but insists that he lives near the stars. Borzage was not a highly educated man, let alone an art historian like Murnau. His approach to the medium was more instinctive. He was a maestro of the pantomime. What inspired him was the sheer power of emotions. This was the great mystery that elevated his melodramas into pure songs of love. Directed by Borzage, Janet Gaynor and Charles Farrell formed a unique couple, at once vibrant with sexual passion and wrapped in a...
Bueno, hemos estado viendo cómo va evolucionando el cine mudo. El cine mudo evoluciona desde los hermanos Lumière cuando empiezan a hacer sus primeros movimientos de cámara, cuando empiezan a ver qué es el plano o el encuadre que están seleccionando. Entonces vamos a hacer nada más para terminar un breve repaso de estos elementos que tienen que ver con el lenguaje cinematográfico. El primer elemento es que tenemos que tener en cuenta que la película lo que quiere hacer es contarte una historia, darte una narración. Entonces todo va a estar supeditado a esa historia que yo te estoy contando. Si es una historia de terror, todo te tiene que dar miedo. Si es una historia de amor, te tienes que enamorar de los personajes. Si es una película musical, tienes que sentir que quieres bailar. Si es una película cómica, te tienes que reír. Entonces todo va a estar ligado principalmente a la narración. En el primer video vimos que el montaje es muy importante porque es el que le va a dar el sentido a las imágenes que yo estoy realizando. Entonces por eso también desde el cine mudo va a ir evolucionando la idea de montaje. La idea de montaje es muy importante y por eso se van a crear grandes teorías acerca del montaje durante la década de los 20, principalmente las de Eisenstein y principalmente las de Bela Balázs y las de Rulagen. Otro elemento muy importante que hemos estado viendo es el encuadre. Lo que yo selecciono dentro del cuadro que quiero que se vea. Si yo no quiero que se vea que aquí atrás está mi ropa sucia, pues la voy a sacar completamente del encuadre. También el encuadre va a tener que ver con la iluminación, va a tener que ver con el color, va a tener que ver con los estados de ánimo que quiero expresar. Otro elemento muy importante serían los movimientos de cámara. En esta última escena veíamos cómo los personajes caminan y van siendo seguidos por un dolly. Y es muy importante los movimientos de cámara. Los movimientos de cámara van a surgir para dar más expresividad a las escenas, ya sea de acción o ya sean de romance. Y otros elementos muy importantes que vimos en las últimas escenas tendría que ver con la escenografía, tendría que ver con la iluminación, que nos van a estar dando estados de ánimo de los personajes, estados de ánimo de aquello que se está contando. Y el último elemento, que quería resaltarlo un poquito más, sería el de la actuación. Ahorita las actuaciones de cine mudo pues nos parecen bastante exageradas, pero en su momento era para expresar aquello que tenía que ver con la historia. La actuación es muy importante. Ahorita las actuaciones son más neutras, son menos exageradas, pero en ese momento de la década de los 20 y la década de los 30, para que el espectador sintiera esa tristeza, sintiera esa depresión, sintiera estados de ánimo positivos o estados de ánimos negativos, tenía que exagerar más con sus gestos y con sus movimientos. Ahorita nada más vimos un panorama bastante somero de cómo evoluciona este lenguaje del cine mudo con estos conceptos de montaje, encuadre y movimiento de cámara. Vamos a seguir viendo esta evolución del lenguaje cinematográfico ya en otros periodos, ya en el cine sonoro, en la época clásica y en la época contemporánea. Bueno, eso sería todo. Muchas gracias. Y continuamos viendo más elementos de la narración cinematográfica.